Hello everyone, welcome back to this series of 100 videos for 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy. Today I'm going to present Canto 21 of Purgatorio. I'm going to introduce the canto by reminding you that at the end of Canto 20th, Dante had felt this huge earthquake, and right after the earthquake, a choir of people, all the souls who were surrounding him, seemed to sing at the same time, and he's left the end of the canto in a completely confused way, thirsty for knowledge, for understanding, to understand what happened. We're still here in Canto 21 on the terrace, the fifth terrace, which is the terrace of Avarice and Prodigality, but then we're going to move on to the last two. These two cantos, 21st and 22nd, are cantos that are really dedicated to the most important relationship and intellectual relationship of Dante, which is the one with Virgil. Yes, they are the cantos of Statius. Statius is introduced as a very crucial character in the Divine Comedy, but what really Dante is focusing on is this relationship with Virgil. And there are good reasons, because Virgil is his own intellectual father and also a poetic father, and Virgil was also the father of Statius. Towards the end of this canto, we can enjoy one of my personal favorite scenes of the entire Divine Comedy, a game of looks and smiles between Dante, Virgil, and Statius, which is masterful. And it's really cool to see how much more now we are seeing Dante smile, in a better mood, and in a disposition of spirit that is more and more positive. So here is how Canto 21 begins in Italian. La sete natural che mai non sazia, se non con l'acqua, onde la femminetta samaritana domandò la grazia. Very musical and a lovely beginning. It's very intense from the layers of meanings here, because first of all, let's see the English translation by Mandelbaum. The natural thirst that never can be quenched, except by water that gives grace, the drought the simple woman of Samaria sought, tormented me. Dante is still thirsty for knowledge, okay. But what is this water that he is mentioning here? This water that gives grace is the divine grace. It's the eternal life coming from only from the grace of God. And it refers to that passage of the Gospel of the Samaritan woman at the well. The doctrine that's been extrapolated from this story in the Gospel is called the water of life discourse. And it's really fundamental because it has to do with the concept of living water in Christianity, based on Jesus' words, whoever drinks this water will never thirst again. The scene, the Evangelic Scene, is very simple. It's there is a Samaritan woman by herself in the middle of the day in the desert, going to the well because she was rejected by society for her personal past. Jesus seeks her out. He approaches her and simply asks for some water. She is surprised because there were many things that were not normal about this behavior from Jesus. And I'm going to leave a link to the Gospel passage because there are many complexities. But in this case, the concept of eternal life is what Jesus expresses to the woman when he tells her, the water that you can give me is normal water, the water that everybody drinks, that leads to more thirst in the future. The water that I am here to give you is water that, if you drink it, you will never thirst again. So being the Gospel, especially the Gospel of John, very polysemic, just like the Divine Comedy, here the elevated philosophical meaning of this story is that we can see the water in the well as everything that we human beings can achieve, that can reach with our only strengths, by ourselves basically. We could call it the earthly knowledge or the earthly goods, everything that we can put our hands on. And of course, this immediately puts the spotlight on Virgil. because we know what Virgil is here to represent: reason and the pre-Christian world. So this kind of limited abilities of human beings. We should think here about the third canto of Purgatorio, Canto 3, where Virgil was talking to Dante saying, mortals remain contented at the quia. When he mentioned the quia, or the why things are the way they are, for you'd had been able to see all, no need there were for Mary to give birth. There wouldn't have had been the need for Mary to give birth if we human beings had been given access to absolute knowledge, to everything. Okay, so Virgil is representing reason, we've always said, and most people really who study Dante say. What does it mean for us though? Because I think there is a very important consequence here. And before we actually leave Virgil, because we are very close to the canto where unfortunately Virgil will leave us in the Divine Comedy, it's important to make this point. So in particular, I want to stress and highlight what the departure of Virgil in the Divine Comedy does not mean. Often I've heard people looking at reason as the only mean to understand truth, what is true and what is not. So what Dante and Christianity really don't mean here with the spotlight on the limitation of reason is to say that beyond reason in Christianity there is irrationality, that basically the religious spirituality is not based on reason. This is a very important point. Beatrice, in other words, she does not represent irrationality or feelings. She represents theology and faith, but it's actually reasonable faith, the one that Beatrice is incarnating, and that provides the full access to truth for Christianity. A very clear proof of this is found in the beginning of the Gospel of John, that's quoted here by Dante as well. If that was true, if Christian doctrines were not dependent on reason, irrational and based on feelings, then the Gospel of John would not begin as it begins, quoting God as Logos, God as reason. And I'm saying this coming from a personal history of somebody who used to think that reason was confined to the empirical world. The reasoning, the theological reasoning around science and faith and the relationship between science and faith that is bridged by philosophy and theology helped me go beyond that and helped me with my reconversion to Christianity. This is my personal history. In particular, the theologian who helped me in this personal process and path was my favorite living theologian, or let's say, we could say the best living theologian, who is Joseph Ratzinger, or the Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI, who had this concept of reason and faith almost at the core of his theology. And I'm going to quote a question that he asked in a paper delivered at the Sorbonne in 1999. He said, "Can reason really renounce its claim to the priority of reason over the irrational, the claim that the Logos is at the ultimate origin of things without abolishing itself? I'm going to repeat, can reason renounce its claim to the priority of reason over the irrational without abolishing itself?" It cannot renounce that. Very important repositioning of the importance of reason within Christian doctrine, not as something that at a certain point we can put aside, like somebody interprets the Divine Comedy. Virgil doesn't matter anymore. From now on, we're going to use only our irrationality, and because that would fall into some sort of sentimentalism or even fideism. Fideism as the doctrine that knowledge depends only on faith, purely on faith. In fact, on this crucial point, Ratzinger once defined fideism as the desire to believe against reason, which is, of course, not a Christian thing. Many Christians no longer, he said, no longer consider it necessary to always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks you for a reason for your hope, which is from the letter of Peter, and which is one of the evangelical basis, the biblical basis of this concept that faith is intertwined with reason and cannot do without reason. It's important because this not only sheds light on the concept of water that Dante is focusing here, but also on the true meaning of Virgil's departure that is upcoming. So we have Virgil and Dante continuing on their path, and Dante felt pity, though the pain of the souls was justified. And here, ed ecco, in Italian, ed ecco is a very biblical expression. In fact, it's exactly the expression that we find in the Gospel of Luke, in the scene of the disciples who are on the road to Emmaus, and they are discussing about Jesus, and all of a sudden a man comes to them from behind, and they don't recognize him at first, but he is the resurrected Jesus. So in this case, Dante helps us, the readers, by making his simile and his metaphor very explicit. He explains it for us. He says, even as Luke records for us that Christ, new risen from his burial cave, appeared to two along his way. So there is a very clear and explicit paragon between Virgil and Dante as the two disciples, and Statius, who is the solo Statius, that we don't know who it is yet at this point of the narration, and the resurrected Jesus. Why is that? Why is Dante playing this game? He is drawing a line of equivalence between Purgatorio soul, who has just completed the process of purification, and the resurrected Jesus, with the meaning that everybody who reaches that point, every soul that reaches that point, undergoes a sort of resurrection in itself, just before getting access to paradise and heaven. So there is this type of equivalence that Dante wants to draw here. And Dante says, we did not notice him until he had addressed us with, God give you, O my brothers, peace, which is the same sentence that Jesus used in the Gospel for the apostles. Not in this scene, but in another one. We turned at once, then after offering suitable response, not in words, probably a nod or some type of courtesy, Virgil began, and may that just tribunal, which has consigned me to eternal exile, Virgil is expressing his sorrow for his fate here as well, place you in peace within the blessed assembly. This soul is surprised. What, he exclaimed, if God's not deemed you worthy of ascent, who's guided you so far along his stairs? We need to understand, I hadn't realized this, that in this moment, Dante and Virgil are not hit by the sun. As a consequence, the soul of Statius cannot see the fact that there is only one shade, and there's not two of them. Otherwise, he would have possibly asked a different question. But in this case, that's what he is asking, is what's happening. And Virgil says, if you observe the signs the angel traced upon this man, Dante has 3 letter P's left on his forehead at this point, you'll see plainly, he's meant to reign with all the righteous. The word traced in Italian is actually in the present tense. Dante says, che l'angel profila. And the fact that it's in the present tense has opened the discussion and the options among scholars that maybe it means that in Purgatorio, every soul has this series of P's on their forehead, and just like it works for Dante, it would work for everybody else. Personally, I don't think that's really the case. It might be a present tense here that Dante is using with a sense of past. It's open to argument, like many things in the Divine Comedy. Virgil here is launching into a very convoluted way to basically just simply say that Dante is still an alive person, while trying to describe his own position as well. And to do that, he mentions the 3 fates from classical mythology. Lachesis, Atropos, and Clotho, they were the 3 sisters. The third one was Atropos, who was clipping or cutting the thread at the end of a person's life. So, since she who spins night and day had not yet spun the spool the Clotho sets upon the distaff, his soul, the sister of your soul and mine, very Purgatorio friendly image in its ascent, could not have climbed here, for he does not see the way we see. He needed some guidance. Therefore, I was brought forth from hell's broad jaws. In fact, the Italian here is a little different than what Mandelbaum translates. In Italian, Dante says, "On Dio fu tratto fuor dell'ampia gola." And fuor dell'ampia gola could mean, in fact, a direct reference to limbo, which is the broader of all the circles of hell, rather than hell's broad jaws, which is more of a general, vague reference to hell. It's probable that here Virgil is actually referencing limbo to guide him in his going, and I shall lead him just as far as where I teach can reach. And then finally Virgil asks the soul the question that Dante has been elucubrating about: what was the earthquake and what was all that shout? It seemed that everything shook down to its sea-bathed shore, while in Italian is pie molli, which means soft feet, the soft feet of the mountain. It seemed everything shook. So Dante says at this point, his question threaded so the needle's eye of my desire, la cruna del mio desio, again this evangelic or biblical term, and probably Dante is playing with the image of the thread that he just referenced with the classical image of the three fates. Again, to go back to that image of the thread. Thread is so the needle's eye of my desire, that just the hope alone of knowing left my thirst a little bit more satisfied. Even before introducing himself, Statius, this third soul, gives almost like a meteorology of the mountain lesson to Dante and Virgil. It's a way for him to explain that everything that happens from the three steps at the entrance of Purgatorio upward is not susceptible to physical elements, to weather, because everything is spiritual. So it's not an actual earthquake, the one that Virgil and Dante felt, but it was something of a spiritual resonance. And he explains that what it is something that happens every single time that a soul from Purgatorio has finished and completed its purification path. And what's interesting is that there is a sort of self-judgment from the soul. There is no an angel or somebody or God who comes and says, okay, you're done with your purification path. It's at verse 61, Dante says, the will alone is proof of purity, and fully free surprises soul into a change of dwelling place from purgatory to heaven. So it's the will at this point of the soul is so honest and pure and seeking truth that is responsible itself for the decision to and the understanding of having completed the path. And I, says Statius, who have lain in this suffering for 500 years and more, just now have felt my free will for a better threshold. The repetition of free will here is very strong. So we are still in this series of central cantos of Purgatorio where Dante is really hammering on the concept of free will. Thus you heard the earthquake throughout the mountain as the spirits praise the Lord. And may he send them speedily upward. So this is the moment when Dante feels a great joy, because he had been very anxious to understand what was going on, and this is a complete clarification for him. And finally, at this point, Virgil asks this third soul, can you tell us something about yourself? And he finally introduces himself as Statius. Now, Statius was a poet. He was born in 45 AD and lived through mainly the 1st century AD. He was not from Toulouse, like Dante mistakenly thought, but this was a mistake that throughout the Middle Ages was quite common. Then later on was understood from historical research that he was actually from Naples in Campania, from the south of Italy. And he was a very honored and celebrated poet, especially during the Middle Ages, to the point that when we see the group of great poets in Inferno number 4, it's legitimate to ask ourselves why Statius is missing from the group of poets, because we have Dante being the sixth among great poets, and the five that he quotes are Homer, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan. A medieval intellectual, let's say, or academic, could have very legitimately asked, why is Statius missing from these greats? Because he was really considered, it's only later on, maybe in our last centuries, that Statius and his reputation in particular became a little bit lesser than these other poets. I don't know the reason why, but there could be a complete separate conversation. But in Dante's times, he was. And so there is a reason, and the reason is that Dante had been engineering this meeting between Statius and Virgil from the very beginning. He wanted Virgil and Statius to meet here for a very specific purpose. And let's see what the purpose is. The masterwork of Statius is considered to be the Thebaid, epic poem in 12 books, by the way, as in 12 books is divided the Aeneid by Virgil. So there are many homages and references to the Aeneid that Statius did in his Thebaid. And I never actually know how to properly pronounce Aeneid into an English context, because I know that in Latin it's pronounced Aeneid, but probably in the English speaking world it might come through as Aeneid. And so apologies if I pronounce it in one way or the other, sometimes without even realizing. On earth my name is still remembered, Statius. I sang of Thebes, the Thebaid, and then of great Achilles, because another, let's say the second masterwork by Statius is the Achilles, but it's an epic poem that was unfinished, so he never had the chance to finish it before dying. I fell along the way of that last labor. The sparks that warmed me, the seeds of my ardor, were from the holy fire, the same that gave more than 1,000 poets light and flame, and we know that it also gave light and flame to the Divine Comedy. I speak of the Aeneid, and when I wrote verse, it was mother to me, mamma. Mamma is even more intimate than madre, so it was mommy to me. It was nurse. My work without it would not weigh an ounce. So fascinating, because these are really feelings that Dante shared entirely. Very often Dante is making characters say things that he feels and he thinks. And in this case, there are spiritual reasons why Dante created and invented this meeting between Virgil and Statius. But from a literary point of view, from a poetic point of view, it's very clear that the love that he had for the Aeneid was unsurpassed, and in singing the lauds and the praises of the Aeneid and of Virgil, Statius is really speaking, but it's Dante with his voice. The next terce is introducing what I referred at the beginning of the video as one of my favorite scenes of the Divine Comedy, because it says, and to have lived on earth when Virgil lived. It's so inspired. For that I would extend by one more year the time I owe before my exile's end. It's inconceivable. He is just one step from paradise. He's ready to go up in heaven in the perfect happiness for all eternity, and yet he would delay that moment for one more year if he only could have lived on earth when Virgil was. So just imagine. So this verse 103 really begins the scene that I was alluding to. These words made Virgil turn to me, and as he turned, his face through silence said, "Be still. Dante, don't embarrass me, don't say anything, don't," because of course Dante had understood what was going on. He was in front of Statius, incredibly intense fan of Virgil, who didn't know that he had Virgil, his idol, just there in front of him. And yet the power of will cannot do all, for tears and smiles are both so faithful to the feeling. And so Dante lets a smile escape here in a really endearing way. I smiled like a man whose eyes would signal. And at this, the shade was silent. Statius is a little confused, obviously, and said, "So, may your trying labor end successfully. Please tell me why you're smiling." In a kind way. And now I'm held by one side and the other. He's got loyalty on one hand, but then courtesy on the other, and he doesn't know which one to choose. It's such an incredibly modern. You can really see it with a series of close-ups in a movie. This scene is so well described. But when therefore I sigh, my master knows why and tells me, "Do not be afraid to speak, but speak and answer and tell him what is inside you, because that's the best thing to do here. At this point, you ruined everything with that little smile." At this I answered, "Ancient spirit, you perhaps are wondering at the smile I smiled." Yes, he is. "I would have you feel still more surprise. He who is guide, this guy here, who leads my eyes on high, is that same Virgil from whom you derive the power to sing of men. In a matter of 10 seconds, Statius feels all these emotions overpower him, and he bends down to kiss Virgil's feet. But Virgil tries to hold him. He goes, "Brother, there's no need. You are a shade. A shade is what you see. We're both shades. We are equal here. There's really no need." And rising, Statius said, "Now you can understand how much love burns in me for you, treating the shades as one treats solid things." Really beautiful, really, really beautiful. Now, this type of tone of mirth, we could say, and happiness, joy, rejoicing, is something that we're going to see more and more in Purgatorio, and of course, a lot of it in Paradiso. It's easy, especially doing such a slow reading of the Divine Comedy as I'm doing here, one canto every week or a couple of cantos every week. It's easy to forget the mood that we have encountered all throughout Inferno, and how at this point almost a polar opposite it was, and all those feelings that Inferno had created in us. But it's really incredible how Dante, only with his imagination, invented this meeting with Virgil. In fact, Statius and Virgil never met. So Dante is not talking about a friendship that is historically true. He's talking about a friendship that he invented. What he is basing this friendship on is a comment that Statius added at the very end of his Thebaid, where he wrote, "So thrive, I pray, but do not envy the divine Aeneid. Follow well back, always adore her traces. If any envy clouds you, it will fade. When I am gone, due honor will be paid." It was kind of peculiar and maybe even unprecedented for a poet of the stature of Statius to pay such an explicit and clear homage to another work or to another poet like Virgil, like he did here at the end of the Thebaid. So, based only upon this conclusion of the Thebaid, Dante creates all this episode of Canto 21 in Purgatorio, which is astounding. Now, the only thing that I haven't mentioned, because we haven't seen it yet in the Divine Comedy, and we'll see it in the next canto, is the actual purpose that Dante had in mind, the spiritual purpose that he had in mind in engineering this meeting between Virgil and Statius. We will see it, but it's even more fascinating, and it has to do probably even more with Virgil and the Virgil spiritual history than Statius himself. So once again, thank you for tuning in, for watching this video, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with Canto 22 of Purgatorio.